welcome you back to What's the Truth podcast. We know it's been a while since we've hosted a podcast, but we are very excited to get this up and running again. And we are joined today by Matt Sharp from the Alliance Defending Freedom for this podcast on religious liberty. This is a live Q&A, and so your questions will be sent in to the number on the screen behind me, and I will filter those out and ask those to our guests with us today. But without further ado, Matt, do you mind to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, thank you all for having me. It's a privilege to be here and worship with you. So I'm an attorney with Alliance Defending Freedom, but more simply, I'm a father, husband. I live northeast of Atlanta. I've got a beautiful wife and three kids that are all kind of middle school ages. We've been here in about 15 years that we moved down here and plugged into a great church up there as well. But it really is just amazing to be able to use my legal skills to be able to defend the gospel. And how I got into this was I'm a pastor's kid, and I remember I was about 11 or 12 years old, and my dad was preaching about just sort of God's truth. And he was telling about how in other parts of the world, and was actually talking about a story out of Canada where a pastor was jailed because he was preaching God's truth about God's design for marriage, that marriage is the union of one man and one woman. And he said, the day may come that here in America, I'm told I can't preach that. I can't preach the truth of marriage. He says, but if that day comes, rest assured, I will continue to preach, whether it's from a pulpit or a jail cell. And I remember as a kid, that just stuck in me. No way can my dad be thrown in jail for this. And so years later, during college, I had this interest for law. And through all of that, heard about this organization, Alliance Defending Freedom, that was there to keep the door open for the gospel. And I saw this opportunity to use my calling as an attorney to help defend people like my dad so that no one ever need to fear being silenced or censored because of their faith, because of what they believe, because of their stand for the truth.
That's great. That's great. Matt, we met about a year ago, and it was probably 2 or 3 years before that I was introduced to Alliance Defending Freedom. Tell us a little bit about what this organization is and what your role with Alliance Defending Freedom is. And before you share that, just so you know, one of your friends and co-workers, Kelvin Cochran, was on our podcast and with us here in this room just a few months ago. So if you could tell us about Alliance Defending Freedom and your work there and who Kelvin Cochran and how that works out.
Yeah. So Alliance Defending Freedom, we are a nonprofit Christian legal organization. Our mission is to keep the door open for the gospel, to stand for the freedom of every person to live and work consistent with God's truth. We were started about 30 years ago by a group of Christian leaders, people like Dr. Dobson, D. James Kennedy, and others, that they saw what was happening in America, and they saw that there was a gap. There wasn't a legal organization there to defend our God-given freedoms of speech, of religious liberty that we're going to talk about, of parental rights and others. And so they got together and said, we need to start an organization. And so they challenged a young man, Alan Sears, and said, we want you to build this organization. So over the years from our small beginnings, we've now grown. We're about 400 people, about 100 full-time attorneys, others. And we do a variety of stuff. We do litigation, so we're there in the courtroom on behalf of Christians. You've probably heard of some of our cases. Jack Phillips, he was the baker from Colorado. It was told by the state of Colorado that he had to design a custom wedding cake celebrating a same-sex marriage, and that violated his deeply held beliefs. So we got to represent him. We've had 14 other cases in addition to Jack's at the U.S. Supreme Court, so very heavily involved in litigation. We also do work in legislatures. We want to not only defend people in court, but we want to make sure our laws reflect our Christian heritage and defend those fundamental freedoms. So I lead a team of attorneys on our legislative side that is traveling across the country and in Congress, helping to craft laws, testifying on them, helping educate and inform lawmakers so that they're passing laws that defend our freedoms. And then finally, we do a lot of training from law students to attorneys to others to help them know what are your rights. What can you do to speak out about God's truth? And then how can you combine your calling, whether it's the legal profession or others, to make a difference for the kingdom of God? So we've been doing that now for 30 years. And you brought up Kelvin Cochran. Kelvin is a great friend. And I actually had the honor to serve on his legal team when he was in a lawsuit against the city of Atlanta when he was fired, as you all know, for publishing a book talking about God's plan for men, specifically calling men to step up. And there was a couple of passages in there that some city officials in Atlanta didn't like, and they fired him over that. And so we got to defend him and get a great victory, not only for Kelvin, but ultimately for the freedom of people here in Georgia to live consistent with their faith, to not have their faith be something that they have to leave at home. And so now, as you probably know, Kelvin is not only a former client, but he's now our chaplain at ADF. And so he's now bringing that same spiritual mentorship that he was pouring into firefighters at the city of Atlanta to all of us. And I've been a beneficiary of that over the years.
That's great. I know you've testified before the U.S. Congress. What is that like?
It is incredible. It's an awesome experience. You walk in and the doors open, and it's Congress. I mean, this is the highest, legislative body. And I still remember the first time I did it. I walked in and we were testifying on religious freedom. That was the whole topic of the hearing, was defending people of faith and making sure that they had the freedom to do so. And you're going to get peppered from members of Congress on both sides and just hostile questions sometimes. And I remember my kids, before I had left, had given me a little slip of paper. And it was the Bible verse, Deuteronomy 31:8. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. And so I had that little slip of paper in my pocket. I was just praying it in my mind. But also I had this supernatural sense of courage. That moment when God has called you to something, and just this sense of God saying, I will be with you here in this moment to testify and to ultimately be a voice for religious liberty before Congress.
That's amazing. We're talking about religious liberty. And so let's start with that question. What is religious liberty, and why do we have any right to that? Is there a biblical foundation for it? Share a little bit of your thoughts on that with us.
Yeah. When you think about religious liberty, most of us probably think of the First Amendment, right? It's there in our founding document. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Religious liberty is simply making sure that the government doesn't interfere with your ability to worship, to work, to speak consistent with your deeply held beliefs. It's a restraint on government. That was the fear of our founding fathers, was that the government would come in, tell you what church you can go to, tell you what religious beliefs are acceptable. Because remember, they were fleeing England at that point, where there was a Church of England, where there was a mandated state church that everyone had to agree to. So many of our founding fathers were people fleeing that, people of different backgrounds, denominations, and beliefs that said, we want a country where we don't have to worry about that. But you go back to the biblical foundations of it, and it's a simple understanding that above civil authority, above our government, is a higher authority to whom I owe my duty. Yes, I'm called to follow the laws of the land. As I was driving down this morning, I see the speed limits on the side of the road. I am called as a Christian to honor those speed limits, to follow those. But what happens when government comes along and passes some law that violates my higher duty to God? Religious liberty is simply the principle that government must give way to God. That if there is a conflict between what the government tells me to do and what God tells me to do, God wins out. And that the government has no power to tell me to do something that I believe places my soul at risk of eternal damnation. So religious liberty ensures that the government stays off of our back, and that when those moments come where we feel deep down that there's something God is calling us to do, or that His Holy Scripture is calling us to do, government gives way to God, and I am free to follow what God tells me to do, consistent with His Scripture, consistent with teaching and biblical doctrine, to make sure that I always have that freedom.
That's good. Let's dive into some specific questions that are coming in from the audience. What happened in the Georgia State Assembly this past term with religious freedom? I'm thinking there was an act that was passed and signed by our governor just recently. What was that, and how does that seem to help, or will it help people?
Yeah. So Georgia became the latest state, I think we're up to about 28 or 29, to pass what's called a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. What this does is enshrine in Georgia law that the government can't interfere with your ability to live out your faith. Whether it's at work, whether it's at school for the students here, whether it's in the marketplace, the government cannot interfere with that unless it basically satisfies what's called strict scrutiny. That's really, really high interest.
Now, let me interrupt you real quick. Does that apply to Christians only or people of other faiths?
This is a law that protects everybody.
Okay.
It ensures that everybody has that freedom to live out their faith, whatever their background is. In fact, this Georgia law was based on a law that Congress passed back in the 90s that applies to the federal government. There was concern that because of a bad Supreme Court ruling that the federal government could restrict people of faith. And so a coalition of Christian, Jews, Muslims, all people of faith came together and said, we want to make sure that all of us have that same religious liberty. And so this federal law was passed. It was bipartisan, actually almost unanimous in Congress. It was signed by then President Bill Clinton. And since then, we've now seen an effort for states to follow that. And unfortunately, Georgia was an outlier. If you look all across the Southeast, if you take the map of the SEC, every state in the SEC had passed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act except for Georgia. And for several years, Alliance Defending Freedom and some great lawmakers had been working to pass it in Georgia. And this year we got it across the finish line. Governor Kemp signed it. And what it does is give each of you a new shield to protect your right to religious liberty. So no matter where you are or your neighbors, no matter what belief system you come from, you know that the state of Georgia cannot interfere with your ability to live out your faith.
Good, good. Next question. There's been a case going on, or a situation, I should say, going on in the state of Maryland recently. Maybe some of our listeners have seen it in the news. What's happening in the state of Maryland with this school, and what a child's been asked to read, and what's going to happen in that situation?
So the state of Maryland had adopted some curriculum standards. And part of this curriculum that was being implemented by a local school was requiring students to read books in the classroom that was being taught to them that was indoctrinating these students in LGBT ideology. And this was going beyond just sort of an overview, but really pushing these kids to sort of affirm and agree with some things that conflicted with their faith. So a group of parents reached out and said, we don't want our kids having to sit through this. We request an opt-out. In other words, we're not telling these schools that you can't still use this book, but when you do so, let our kids be excused. You can still have the lesson, but let them go into the library, do something else. Just don't force our kids to sit through and be indoctrinated in something that violates our beliefs. These opt-outs are pretty common. Most states have them when it comes to topics like this, when it comes to issues of sexuality, lets parents pull their kids out. Well, this school district said, no, you have to sit through it. Your kids have to sit through it. We don't care that you don't want your kids to be indoctrinated to this. So the parents filed a lawsuit challenging that. So this is about the right of parents, the ability of you as parents to have the freedom to train your children consistent with your religious beliefs. You go back to a religious principle. Is there anything more foundational, more rooted in Genesis than this right of parents to direct the care and upbringing of your kids? When he called to Adam and Eve and said, be fruitful and multiply. And then time and time throughout, you read, Genesis, Exodus, through the Mosaic law, talks about train your children up in this, write it on the door frames of your house, speak it, pray over in them. This idea that you have a right as parents to train your children. And here's Maryland coming along and saying, no, you don't have that right. We know better. So this case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, was actually just argued within the past month, challenging that Maryland policy, challenging that school district's effort to indoctrinate children, and ultimately asking, court, give us as parents the right to decide what our children are and are not exposed to. Give us the right to opt our kids out of this dangerous curriculum. This case is huge because it not only impacts that school district in Maryland, but if, as we hope, the Supreme Court rules for these parents, then in all 50 states, parents are going to have stronger rights. They're going to have more ability to be involved in their kids' schools, to know what's going on. So that way, no matter how you choose to educate your kids, whether you homeschool, private school, or public school, you're going to have more power than ever to make sure that you get to make those decisions. And I think that ties so well with religious liberty because, again, it's recognizing that there is a higher authority over children than the government. And that's you as mom and dads to make those decisions. So we're excited about that case. We were able to file an amicus brief supporting that case at the U.S. Supreme Court, sharing some stories that we have on behalf of parents. And we're hopeful we're going to get a great ruling there.
That's good. What happens when someone's religious freedom rights potentially harm me or they harm you? Is there a balance between the freedom to practice religion and when religious practices could bring harm? And I'm particularly, the question is particularly asking in the context of Sharia law, but I think the application is much broader than that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, there is a balance. One of the great things about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is that it recognizes that there are limits to religious freedom. So let's say my religious freedom and my faith says, I want to force everyone in the entire world that I interact with to, when I come up to them and say, Christ is risen, they must respond, he is risen indeed. We just passed the Easter season. What if I could force everyone else to do that? What if they don't share my faith? Can my religion force someone else to say or do something that they disagree with? No. And so in those instances, that Religious Freedom Restoration Act and our laws say, while the government can't force me to do something that violates my beliefs, neither can I force someone else to do something that violates their beliefs. That's that balance. Think of it like there's a bubble around me and my family that the government can't interfere with, that others can't come in and interfere with how we decide to raise our kids and our practice of our faith. But that also means around other people and around other families, they've got that same bubble that neither the government can interfere with them, nor can I force my beliefs on them. So that's what real religious liberty is. It's kind of let me be, let me worship God consistent with the dictates of my conscience, while I also respect the freedom of others to do the same. And that's where the government does have the ability to step in when I'm now trying to do something that forces my religion on someone else or forces someone else to do something that violates their conscience and their beliefs. Then the government can step in and say, Matt, there's lines there. We're not going to interfere with your religion, but we're also going to let others have that freedom as well.
Good, good. Let's shift gears to school. I know it's a hot topic and school choice and so forth, but let's focus first on Christians who are teaching in a public school setting. How can we come alongside them and support them, as well as what happens when they're being censored for talking about their faith in Christ? How can we support in those situations?
I love working with teachers. I talked earlier about how Alliance Defending Freedom, in addition to litigation and legislation, we do training. I've got the opportunity over the years to do training with teachers, with coaches that are involved in Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And there's so much misinformation about teachers' rights. I think a lot of times they've been told that their faith is something they have to leave at home, check it at the door. And that's simply not true, because even the U.S. Supreme Court years ago, in this case called Tinker versus Des Moines, said neither students nor teachers lose their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate. What does that mean? It means teachers can have their faith and bring it with them to school. They can do things like have a Bible study with other teachers. They can wear a cross or have a Bible on their desk at school. And they can even respond if a student comes and asks them a question about, hey, teacher, I understand you go to such and such church. Tell me what you believe. What teachers have to be careful of is, like we talked about with the last question, can they force their views on others? Can they force their views on students? No, teachers can share their faith and live out their faith, but they also have to be careful to respect other students' beliefs. So a lot of times we'll get questions from teachers of, well, what can I do if a student's wanting to ask me about my faith? What I always encourage them is to say two things. Number one, say, that's a great question. I'd love to talk with you more. Could I perhaps meet with you and your parents outside of school? And then have those conversations outside of school, because now you're accomplishing, number one, you've taken off your teacher hat. Now you're just a private citizen. Number two, you're respecting parental rights. You're respecting the right of those parents to decide how their child is raised. And so I always just encourage teachers, yes, you can have your faith at school. There's ways that you can be involved with religious clubs or host Bible studies, but also respect other people's religious beliefs, respect other parents' rights over their kids, and you can find a great way to still be authentic to your faith while still respecting those limits on others people's rights to religious liberty as well.
Yeah, that's an educator. What about someone in the corporate world? If they're more like a private company that has specific standards and expectations, do employees have those same rights as well?
They sure do. So let me kind of split that up into two. Let me talk about employees first. There are federal laws that protect your right to religious freedom at work. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you can force your employer to do whatever you want. But what the law says is that your employer has to provide a reasonable accommodation for you to live out your faith. So, for example, let's say you believe that Sunday is a holy day, and you go to your employer and say, I would ask not to work on Sundays. Your employer is supposed to accommodate that and let you have Sundays off unless it is a really heavy burden on the employer. So let's say you work at a factory and you are the sole person that knows how to fix a piece of machinery. The machinery breaks down on Sunday morning. They can call you in and say, we need you to come in and fix it because The employer has to be able to keep things running, keep the factory working. But if there's someone else that can do the job, then the employer needs to say, we'll call that other person so that you can go and live out your faith. So as an employee, you do have the right to live out your faith at work. Again, you can share your faith with coworkers when they ask. You can have prayer meetings and Bible studies during free time. There's a lot you can do as an employee to continue to have your faith with you at work. When you're an employer, you can also do that. You can be a Christian employer. You can incorporate your faith into what you do. So that could be things like having your bylaws and other things talk about how you exist to glorify God. Many of you, we're here in Georgia, we have Chick-fil-A. And if you read Chick-fil-A's founding documents, it says their goal exists not to make chicken, though they do that very well. Their goal exists to glorify God and to bring him praise and honor through the work that they do. There's other businesses like Hobby Lobby that are set up that way. So they take their business, but still operate it in a way that's closing on Sundays or doing other things to glorify God in what they do. Now, again, you have to respect employees' religious freedom. So you can't be an employer that says, you must go to this church or you must worship the way I do or else. You have to respect those employees' religious freedom, but you also can cultivate a Christian environment, playing Christian music, doing other things that share your faith while still allowing individual employees to live out their faith and not be coerced into believing something they may disagree with.
Yeah, thank you. Next person asked that it sounds like the president may have talked about bringing the church back and what it stands for. Have you heard this? And do you think there's any truth to that?
Yeah. One of the things we've been very encouraged about is just sort of the renewed interest in religious liberty. In fact, just a couple of days ago, the president issued an executive order calling for a religious liberty commission. And this is a very sort of diverse group of individuals all coming together with a shared goal, saying we have different beliefs, different values, different backgrounds, but America ought to be a place where religious freedom thrives, where the government actually encourages people of faith, encourages religious organizations. One of my favorite studies was a few years ago. There was a group that said, what is the value of religious liberty? What is the value of religious organizations? I mean, you think of just here at your local congregation, how much you all invest in your community, that you pay your tithes and offering and then turn it around and bless others in the Georgia area, even across the world. They valued it at over $1 trillion that religious organizations contribute to the well-being of America. So I think it's in the country's best interest to invest in that and to say we want more religious organizations doing adoption foster care, doing drug and alcohol abuse ministries, investing in homeless ministries. It's incredible.
That's a big number. Let's let that sink in for just a moment with the audience. You said $1 billion or $1 trillion? $1
trillion.
So if we compare that to the gross domestic product, I mean, we're talking a significant amount of money
that's right
coming out of places of faith. That's amazing.
It is. It just shows at the heart of all of this, we do serve a God that calls us not to be insular and focused on ourselves, but to go into all the world, to bless where we live, and to see religious groups step up to that, and to see Christians in particular be among the most generous people in our country. It's a great testament to the gospel.
Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the state of Oklahoma with school choice.
So this is really exciting. Oklahoma is one of many states that has charter schools. And recently, a religious group, a Catholic group, had said, we want to start a religious charter school, and applied to do so. This was an online virtual charter school. So many families signed up. I think they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families all wanting to be part of this. Well, unfortunately, the state of Oklahoma tried to shut that down. The Attorney General said, sorry, we can't have a religious charter school. Charter schools can only be secular. Well, the problem with that is when you are opening up this opportunity, charter schools, and you're saying any group can start a charter school. If I wanted to start a charter school focused on classical music, I could do that. If I wanted to start a charter school focused on electrical engineering or whatever, I could do that. Why are religious groups the only group that is shut out from that? So Alliance Defending Freedom, we've been working to challenge that policy. And we just had the case go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is a case much bigger than just whether this religious group, this Catholic organization, can start a charter school and operate it consistent with their faith and with families that are wanting to choose that. Again, no families being forced to go there. They can go anywhere they want. But families that want this, they ought to have that option. Well, if the government can exclude them from starting a charter school, from contracting with the state, who else can the government exclude? There's countless religious organizations that regularly work with the government. You think of how many adoption and foster care organizations, They work with the state, right? Because the state will have these kids that are needing a home or needing temporary arrangements, and they work with these private ministries to help place these kids in a loving home. If that charter school can be excluded, does that mean all these other groups can be excluded as well? So that's why I said this case is so much more than just educational freedom, and it is absolutely about that. But it's about making sure that religious organizations, religious people don't become second-class citizens, pushed out of these programs and opportunities.
But let's perhaps for some of our listeners who may not be as familiar, it seems like there's a common notion in our minds that there must be separation between church and state. Now, I know you know the Constitution a lot better than I do, but if I'm not mistaken, that phrase is not in there. Help us understand what the Establishment Clause actually says.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most misinterpreted phrases in American history. So this phrase, separation of church and state, came from a letter that I think it was Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of people in a Densbury Baptist church. They were concerned not about the church influencing the government and politics, but about government interfering with the church. Remember, these are people that, for them, the American Revolution was very fresh in their minds. Coming from England, and the Church of England was very fresh in their minds. And they were concerned that in this new government, we were going to go back to the ways of England, where the government was dictating where you can worship, what you can believe, which churches get government funding and which don't. And Thomas Jefferson wrote and said, "Do not worry. There is a high wall of separation between church and state," meaning the state, the government, cannot come in and interfere with the church. It is a wall to protect churches against government interference. It was never intended to limit churches' ability to influence government or to be involved in public life. So a lot of what we're doing in these cases is reinforcing that original meaning, that our laws were always meant to protect religion, not to box it in. So what we want to see here is this group in Oklahoma, that they have the same opportunity to be part of these government programs, to start charter schools, to thrive and be connected to public life and not be boxed in.
That's good. We've talked about Oklahoma, we talked about Maryland, and a little bit of Georgia. What are some other top issues right now, top legislative or judicial cases that are going on across the nation or that might be argued this summer in the Supreme Court?
Well, one of the big issues we've really been involved in is this gender ideology that's just sadly swept across the country over the past few years. I remember it was about 2015, and I worked on our public school team, so we were helping kids do things like start Bible clubs or be able to hand out religious flyers. And we started getting calls from parents saying, "I think my school let a guy into my daughter's restroom." We were a little shocked at first, but as we started digging into this, we found it was more and more common. This was being pushed at schools across the country, and many parents had no idea what was going on. These secret policies that were saying, yeah, if you think you're a girl, then yes, you can be in the girls' locker room or restroom. You can play on the girls' sports team. You can force others to call you by female names and pronouns. What we saw was this gender ideology spreading its tentacles throughout these schools and then spreading beyond that into medicine, so that now a kid that maybe feels uncomfortable with their body is being told, well, maybe it's because you were born in the wrong body. Maybe not, you're not really a boy. Maybe you're a girl, and we need to put you on female hormones and even do surgeries on you to change your body to look more like a girl. At the root of all of this is this dangerous gender ideology. And I look at it as much more than just a cultural thing. This is a biblical issue. Again, we've been going back again and again to sort of Genesis 1 and 2. The family as the foundation of all things. Religious freedom, a recognition that there is a God and we have a duty to him. And in the midst of all of that is Genesis saying God created them what? Male and female. In his image, he created them, man and woman. This is an attack on God's design of who we are as men and women, as boys and girls, undermining that. And so we've been very involved in this. We've been filing lawsuits on behalf of female athletes in Connecticut, these 4 incredible young women that lost out on 15 championships, 16 medals that were taken away, and records that were taken away by 2 males that identified as female that were just going in and dominating women's track and field throughout Connecticut. We know here in Georgia the story of Riley Gaines, who at the NCAA swimming championship lost out because of a male that was allowed to compete in the women's category. And we've heard countless tragic stories of women being forced to share like a women's shelter. There was a case we were involved in Alaska where this Downtown Hope Center, a Christian ministry, was told by the city of Anchorage that they had to allow a man to stay overnight in their women's shelter. This is a shelter where you had women that were fleeing trafficking, abusive situations. They slept on cots that were literally an arm's length apart, and the city was telling them, you have to allow a man into this women's shelter. No. God created us as male and female, and those differences sometimes matter. And where they matter is in these private spaces, where they matter is in sports. So we've been involved challenging those policies. We've gotten some great wins. In fact, just recently, we had helped the state of Idaho craft a law making sure that in public schools and locker rooms, restrooms, on overnight trips, girls are not forced to share these facilities with guys. And the federal courts upheld Idaho's law, recognizing that states and government and schools have a strong interest in protecting privacy and maintaining those differences between guys and girls in these spaces. So I'm encouraged by that. There's a lot more cases in the hopper. There's a big one pending at the Supreme Court where Tennessee, along with about 25 other states, had passed laws protecting kids from these gender transition drugs and surgeries, the puberty blockers and hormones. And there was a challenge to that. And again, we want to uphold the right of states to be able to protect kids from this ideology, and that means protecting them in medicine as well, so that no kid is ever damaged by this dangerous ideology.
We appreciate all that ADF is doing. And this may get into some things that maybe aren't able to speak on in this podcast, but how does ADF go about supporting itself? I mean, I know legal fees are very expensive. How does this work?
Well, number one, we are a nonprofit organization. So we are solely based on donations, large and small, from a little grandmother that's on fixed income that may send us $5 a month to others that business owners that are able to do more. And because we're nonprofit, not only are we dependent upon donations, but it also means when we take a case, we do it free of charge. So whether it is us answering the phone call to provide some solutions to a family that has some questions, to sending a demand letter, all the way to a case that may take 10 years to go through the court system, like Jack Phillips' case, the Colorado baker I talked about earlier. We're able to do those cases free of charge because so often no citizen has the money to go up against the U.S. government. You know, they have hundreds and hundreds of full-time attorneys and unlimited money, and to think one little person could stand against the government, well, that's what God called us to do. And so by his grace and favor, he has given us the resources to start from a small ministry 30 years ago to grow to what we are today, but is ultimately on the generosity of people that believe in what we're doing, that believe in the victories that we're getting, and that recognize that whether it's a lawsuit that we win in Colorado or a law here in Georgia that we help pass, it really makes a difference in our lives. And preserving something very important about America is truly a land of the free.
That's amazing. Well, thank you for what you do. We ground everything we do here on the Bible. And I know you've taken us back to Genesis 1 and 2 a few times already this morning. In the Bible, it is quite clear that Christians are to go and make disciples, that evangelism and disciple making is the heart and the call of every Christian. How does that relate to religious freedom? Is one above the other? Or do they work in tandem with each other? What do you think?
Yeah, I think they're very much connected in a couple ways. Number one, that call to discipleship starts in the home. So when we talk about parental rights, it is that ability of you as parents, as grandparents, to make disciples of your children and grandchildren. But think of another way of religious liberty. We'll take it in the school context. Many of you are familiar with Fellowship of Christian Athletes. They're a community organization that gets connected with a local school to help give the gospel to athletes, to other students. There's other great organizations. Young Life is another amazing organization that's starting clubs in schools. All of that is about discipleship. It is churches and local organizations that say, we want to invest and disciple the next generation in our schools. We're able to come along and use those principles of religious liberty to defend that. So just like the schools work with other groups, you think of, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, or community groups, even within the school, you may have a chess club, you may have a art club, you may have all of these other clubs. When the school opens the door for community groups to come in and be involved in students, or opens the door for students themselves to start clubs, we use religious liberty to say, and you Christians have the same right to go in and start a Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Or students, you have the same right to start a Bible study at your school. So religious freedom and that ability to disciple absolutely go hand in hand. Because if our faith is something that is only about me and my family, that's not very much freedom. My faith means the freedom to live consistent with my faith, to go out and share my faith with others, to disciple others. And so whether that's in schools, whether that's in the workplace, or just going out on a street corner and being able to say, let me tell you about my Savior, Jesus Christ, religious liberty protects all of that.
That's good. You have mentioned Thomas Jefferson and our founding forefathers. Let's go back about 20 years prior to that and the Revolutionary War. Was it justified on biblical grounds or not?
That's a great question, complex question. I would say
I'm only asking the questions of the audience.
that's right. That's right. It's a great audience. I would say this. One of the first questions we talked about is what is religious liberty? And rooting it in that there is a higher authority we are all accountable to. And the government has no authority to tell me who I can and cannot worship, where I can and cannot go to church. There was a real concern of the Church of England coming in and starting to dominate our country, or the colonies, I guess, at that time. And you look at all of the founding fathers, and it's funny enough, I've been working on some great textbooks and stuff that have been written about this to really show the Bible's influence on America. And so many of our founding fathers kept going back to that principle of religious freedom. They wanted America to be a unique place where anyone could come and worship according to the dictates of their conscience. Part of this Revolutionary War, yes, there was a lot of grievances, as laid out in the Declaration of Independence and taxation without representation, but you cannot deny that there was also a very important core of we have been too long penalized, punished because we don't follow the Church of England, and this fear that we were going to lose that. And so I think part of that was a justification to be able to say that ability to worship according to the dictates of our conscience is something worth fighting for. And now it's one of the reasons ADF exists. We're not doing it with swords and shields or muskets or whatever. We're doing it in the courtroom and those avenues that our founding fathers opened us. I know a lot of times attorneys get bad reputations, and a lot of it's deserved. But at the same time, our founding fathers in their wisdom recognized the court system as a place where our grievances against the government can be heard, where the one little family can stand against the entire might of the government and win. That's why I love our court system. That's why our founding fathers wanted it to be a co-equal branch. There with the presidency, there with Congress was the judicial system, so that the individual citizen could have some way to have their grievances resolved. And I think that goes back to our founding fathers recognizing they didn't have that. And when they established our country, they wanted to make sure that religious freedom was preserved and that the average citizen could always have a way that their rights could be vindicated against government overreach.
Good. What if a mom or dad sees their son or daughter come home from school with a book from the school library they're very uncomfortable with it? What do they do? Do they have any action they can take? A controversial book, what do they do with it?
Yeah. We hear that a lot, and unfortunately we're seeing schools become a place of indoctrination, whether it's LGBT stuff or other views. There's a lot of things schools should be doing in all of this. Number one is respecting parental role in all of this. If a parent finds out that something's being taught in the classroom or something in their library, bring it up, raise your voice, show up at a school board meeting, because a lot of times these books are being put on the shelves and no one really knows about it. No one knows what's there. And so we encourage parents, when you see something that concerns you as a parent, something that's being taught in your school or made available to your kids that you have concerns about, that maybe put it behind the counter, make it where parents have to be involved in checking it out. Speak up, show up at a school board meeting, raise concern, because we've seen time and again when parents get together, like these parents in Maryland did, when they said, we are concerned about our kids being exposed to this, stand up and say something about it. And quite often, just that act of speaking up at a board meeting saying, let me read a passage from this book that's in your library, and especially if it has very sexually vulgar stuff, that can be a catalyst for the school board to say, whoa, we didn't know that had gotten in our collection. Let's take that off the shelves, because there are things that should not be read and exposed to a vulnerable child.
I've heard that the local school board is potentially the place we have the greatest opportunity to leverage our voice compared to voting for a presidential election or congressional election. Why is the school board so powerful, and why do we have such a unique opportunity as citizens to influence it?
One of the great things about America is that we are not a top-down government. Yes, DC has a lot of power, but even the Supreme Court has recognized it's not the place of the government to dictate what happens at your local schools. It is local schools that set curriculum. It's local schools that set policies. There is no better place where you can get engaged than to get plugged into your local school. Running for the school board, volunteering, just knowing what's going on. We have seen so often where a small group of parents concerned about what's happening in their schools get together, raise support, get on the school board, and help bring about good policies. I can't tell you how many phone calls I've had, and they're some of my favorite calls when someone says, "We just reclaimed our school board, and there's a group of us that we have a voting majority, and we're concerned about some policies that were adopted previously, and we want to undo them and put in good policies. Can you help us?" Yes, absolutely, I can. So just think, with just a little bit of effort, I mean, even just looking in the people of this congregation, some of you, God is calling to step into that role, to run for a place on your school board, to volunteer, to get more engaged at your local school. That is such a vital place because that is where the next generation is being raised. And if we pull back from public schools and say, they're lost, we're just going to focus on homeschool, private school. Yes, there's a place for that. My kids go to a classical school. But for a lot of families, that's not an option. Public school is the only option. And I will not abandon those children. We have a calling, like you said earlier, to not just focus on our institutions and our bodies, but to go into all the world. And that means going into public schools and getting engaged and involved there. And when you do so, you can have such a huge impact, helping shape curriculum, helping shape policies, and ultimately making it a place where religious freedom and free speech can thrive.
Good. Let's go back to Oklahoma. One listener is asking the question, if this goes the way I suppose that you were describing it could with ADF's influence and arguments, does this risk other doctrines we as Christians might disagree with becoming embedded into core curriculum across the nation?
Not at all. What this is about is the ability of groups to form charter schools. Again, no one is forced to attend these schools. This is entirely voluntary. But do I believe other faiths should have the same ability to start a charter school consistent with their views? Yeah. Because if the government can come in and decide, well, we like this religion and not that religion, what if it's my religion? Again, I go back to what my dad was saying from the pulpit. A government that can tell whether it's Muslims or Jews or any other faith, you're not welcome here, can one day turn around to this church, to my dad, and say, you're not welcome here either. Religious freedom is about getting the government out of that and letting each of us decide for ourselves, consistent with our beliefs. But then you say, but Matt, you really are comfortable with charter schools of other faiths? Yes, because I also go back to scripture and I go back to stories like, Elijah on Mount Carmel. I believe in the truth of the Bible, and that when you put Christianity against any other religion, the truth is going to prevail. I'm not threatened by other religions. We shouldn't be, because we know Jesus Christ is our ultimate victory. He has conquered death and the grave. The victory is his, and we get to celebrate that with him. So it's one of the reasons I so believe in religious freedom, because I want all people to have that ability to follow their freedom, to worship consistent and live consistent with their conscience. Because I ultimately know at the end of the day, that means us as Christians, as we are going into all the world, have the freedom to go and share the life-saving power of Jesus Christ with others.
What happens when the government pushes back, though, against your religious freedom? I mean, I know that's a general question, but what are some principles or guidelines that you would give for someone who feels like there's an infringement upon their religious liberties?
Number one, know your rights. So often, we as Christians don't really know the full extent to which our Constitution and our laws protect our freedoms. Again, we talked about the separation of church and state. I've gotten calls where parents say, my child's wanting to start a club at school, and I know there's a separation of church and state. And I say, whoa, 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 stop right there. There is not a separation of church and state like you're talking about. So just to know your rights, that you have the right to share your faith at school, at work, that you have the right to do all of these incredible things to authentically live out your faith. Number two, speak up. So often, the person pushing back on your religious freedom is also misinformed. We've had so many times where a principal or an employer or someone else just thinks they have to have a religion-free environment. They've been told that, they've been misinformed. So by you showing up and saying, these are my rights and I want to share them with you, a lot of times that can resolve the situation. Again, we've had so many times where a parent shows up at a school board meeting or sits down with a superintendent and says, I think you're breaking the law. Share some information from Alliance Defending Freedom or someone else, and that resolves the problem. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes you have people digging their heels, and that's where we come in to provide the legal support, to provide the resources. Because again, when we are taking a case to court, we're doing no different than Paul did when, remember that story, and he was being beaten by a Roman. And Paul says, hey, don't you know I'm a Roman citizen? You cannot beat me. You cannot jail me without just cause. What was he doing? He was asserting his rights as a Roman citizen to not be beaten, abused by these Roman guards. If Paul availed himself of his citizenship and of his rights as a Roman citizen, should we not be doing the same? Because by Paul doing that, he was able to continue to preach the gospel. And by us doing that and availing ourselves of the laws and the legal system, are we not opening the door and keeping the door open for the gospel? A real quick story. We had one of these cases that was brought up, and it was a young girl in New Jersey. She was wanting to, Pennsylvania. She was wanting to hand out invitations. Her church was having a Christmas party, and it was open to the community, and you'd go play games and activities, and at the end, they were going to share about the true meaning of Christmas. So she had these great little invitations, and she went to all of her classmates and put one in their cubbies. So just said, you can have it, go home with it. A teacher sees them, grabs them, takes them to the principal, and the principal said, oh, you can't do that, confiscates all of them, calls the family and says, you cannot hand these out at school. You cannot proselytize at school. That's what they used. They tried to talk with them. They said, no, you're violating our daughter's rights. School didn't back down. So we filed a lawsuit challenging that, and the school really dug in their heels. We got a victory. They then appealed it. They said, no, we think you got it wrong. So they took it up to the Court of Appeals. We got an even bigger victory there that covered not only Pennsylvania, but New Jersey and Delaware. This little girl who just wanted to hand out an invitation changed the law for 3 states. Come to find out, that same policy that her school district was enforcing, the anti-proselytizing policy, 250 other school districts in Pennsylvania had the exact same policy. So after we got that victory, we wrote letters to those school districts and said, guess what? You've got an unconstitutional policy. So again, her stand changed the law, states, school districts everywhere. But here's the real beauty of the story. After all of that happened, the next time her church had an event, she was able to hand out an invitation. She had a friend come. That friend accepted Christ. Next thing you know, that friend told her mom and dad, you got to come check out this church. That family came to church and they got saved. We can talk about rights and we can talk about freedom all day long, and that is vital, and it's what I fight for every day. But the reason I do it is because I believe the power of these words that we say, the power of our witness to impact and make eternal differences in people's lives. That's why we fight for this, not to get a court victory or whatever, because at the back end of that court victory is the gospel getting to somebody that needs it, to make a difference in some kid's life and some family's life that can bring about a change that will reverberate throughout eternity.
That's amazing. What a story. Thanks for sharing that with us. We do have some middle school and high school students in the room. What else can they do to get involved in these things?
Yeah, I love working with middle school, elementary, high school kids. It's one of my favorite things. Like I was saying earlier, God has put you in a mission field. You have influence there to be able to share the gospel with your friends in ways that us as adults can't do. There are conversations that you're going to have that no one else can have. So number one, I encourage you to be bold. I know sometimes it's hard to be one speaking out in those moments, but God's placed you there. Number two, there's so many things you can do. Like I said, if your church here is having a community event, show up at the school with flyers, start handing them out, saying, hey, you got to come to our church's event. This is going to be great. We're having a lock-in. We're having a concert. We're having an event in our parking lot open to the community. Invite people to come. Number two, take your Bible with you. During lunch, get some friends around. Say, hey, let me just share a little passage that our youth pastor talked about this past Sunday. When one of your friends is feeling down, pray for them. The Constitution protects your right to do all of those things. There are case after case after case ruling in favor of your ability to do it. Get together with some others. Start a Bible club if you don't have one. If there's a free period or before or after school, something like that, you have the right to get together with others, to worship, to pray for one another. I think of another case we had in Colorado. There's this young kid, Chase Windebank. He was a high school student, and during his 9th grade year, they had a little free time at lunch, and he would just get together with some others and start praying for his classmates for the school. Group of 3 students over the years grew to 90 students, giving up their lunch period to go together and pray together once a week. Well, the school found out about it. They tried to shut it down. We filed a lawsuit and got a huge victory for Chase and others, defending their right to pray together, to worship together, to lift up their school. So again, you never know that God may be using you to help change your school, your state, the nation, just by taking a stand.
That's good. You mentioned earlier the uniqueness of the American political government structure, 3 branches and the checks and balances. How can we continue to trust when it seems like sometimes the executive branch overrules or steps in, or at the same time, maybe on the flip side, judicial activism is taking place? How do we think through that well?
Yeah, I think this number one emphasizes the importance of engagement. We engage in the legal system by filing lawsuits, but we should also engage in politics. And that I just simply mean vote. Call your elected representative when something's happening that matters to you. If there is a law being discussed or an action being brought up that impacts our freedom of speech, our parental rights, our religious liberty, let your voice be heard. I'm telling you, I do a lot of work in legislatures. They don't want to hear from me. They want to hear from you. They want to hear from the people in their district. So just get engaged. And I'm telling you, people showing up can make a difference. I think of another story in California. They were trying to pass a law that was going to impact homeschool families and was going to allow the state to come in and start monitoring homeschool families. It's California. They seem like, oh, it's a lost cause. The state is against us. There's nothing we can do. Well, the homeschool community started mobilizing and they showed up at the Capitol. 3,000 homeschool families gave up a day, drove down to Sacramento, and packed the Capitol. It was overwhelming. The fire marshal was freaking out. Everything was going on because all these families simply showed up. And it so overwhelmed the legislature that the law died. It was just people showing up. That's what gives me confidence in all of this, is that we do have a system of checks and balances. When the judicial branch gets out of whack, you have Congress and the others that can step in. If the executive branch or Congress get out, you've got the judicial branch. It is the God-given wisdom to our founders that they said, we don't just want a king, we don't just want a parliament, we don't just want a judiciary, we want all 3 working together. And at the end of it, I am confident that just like God inspired our founding fathers to the endeavor to write our Constitution, to put all of that in, God has not abandoned America. And when we pray for our leaders, and we are called to pray for our leaders, I firmly believe that God steps in, even when things seem out of control and may go in a direction we like or don't like, that God's there saying, my hand is still on America. I'm going to guide it where I want it to, as long as we, the church, remain faithful to pray and to get involved.
Very briefly on this question, what's the balance between suffering as a Christian and standing up for our rights?
Yeah, I think there's a place for both. And sometimes filing a lawsuit is suffering. So many of our clients, I think of Jack Phillips, the Colorado baker. I think of Baronelle Stutzman. She was the florist from Washington State. They got hate mail. We've had clients that lost their jobs because of a lawsuit that they filed standing for their freedom. There is suffering in standing for what is right. But I go back to that Paul. He could have said, all right, Roman soldiers, just keep beating me, just whatever. It's suffering. I'm glad I can take stripes for the cause of Christ. But Paul also knew God had given him Roman citizenship. And for him just to say, I'm going to set that aside and ignore it, I think was an affront to God's gift to him. God has gifted us the freedom to live in America. He's gifted us laws that protect our rights. And I think when we don't use those, it's an affront to God's gracious gift towards us to be born here, to live here, and to the countless men and women that have paid the ultimate sacrifice to preserve these freedoms for us.
That's good. We have more questions than we have time to dive into this morning, but I do want to say thank you so much for being with us. Before we wrap this up, though, help us as a church family and other listeners who will listen to this later on know how we can be informed about what's going on with particularly Alliance Defending Freedom, how we can pray for the ministry and the work that's taking place, and other ways that we may could help.
Yeah. Well, anyone that's interested, you can visit our website, adflegal.org. That's ADF, short for Alliance Defending Freedom, adflegal.org. We're also on social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, all of that stuff to follow our cases. And if God so leads you, if you want to contribute to what we do, to be able to help us take another case free of charge or to do more training free of charge to groups, we obviously welcome that. But above all else, we do ask for your prayers. We've got 3 cases at the Supreme Court right now. We've got the Oklahoma case I mentioned. We've got one that's going to be argued this fall on behalf of a counselor that's being told she can't help counsel kids that are going through confusion. And we're also representing the state of South Carolina in their effort to defund Planned Parenthood and protect the sanctity of human life in that state. Pray for our attorneys working on those cases, but pray for the justices that they will rule righteously as they issue these decisions in the Maryland case, because at the end of the day, our theme verse at ADF is John 15:5. I'm the vine, you are the branches. A man remains in me, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And we know at Alliance Defending Freedom, apart from God, we can do nothing. So your prayers, your financial support, your prayer for our clients is always welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. And to each of you, thank you for being here this morning and joining us for this live Q&A. We've done this in partnership with our church's podcast, What's the Truth? And I want to invite you to continue staying up to date with that through Spotify, Apple, or Amazon, or however you listen to your podcast. Please know that we will have another one coming out shortly after this one with Alfred and Debbie Jones with our new one-way ministry with our church. So look forward to releasing that in the next couple of weeks, as well as this one that will be posted live as well.